You start plugging in every operational level risk to your register, it becomes white noise very quickly. If you're going to decompose risks to component areas, you've got to think about it very carefully and the impact of, if there is value in even doing it to that level.
Sometimes challenge is perceived as being a negative thing, but actually that challenge shows a level of understanding and engagement.
Our job here is to make sure we don't have a significant cyber incident, data incident. And I think saying that carries weight. I think 2026 will be the year of agentic AI and the concerns around agentic AI, if we want to boil it down to sort of the common talking point at the moment.
If you can turn around and say, well, we're only going to make 90% of that instead of 100% of it, all of a sudden it becomes really tangible, because they also know the exit multiple that they want to achieve on the valuation of the business.
As soon as you get to expected loss values, you're working in quantified outputs.
I understand some, maybe not kind of this week, but very recent congratulations are in order. The Arise Sir Jonny CISO, rather than just head of cybersecurity.
Yeah, no, sort of stepped into the role about 6 months ago. Hit Forge, was lucky to sort of get that opportunity to step up into it. I naively, was, because we didn't have a CISO, so that it's a new role for the business as well. So naively was, of the opinion that, I'm, largely conducting the requirements of CISO, and I was largely conducting the requirements of CISO already anyway. But there's a couple of functional units that I've inherited now as part of that step into directorship, and it has been a busy 6 months. It's been 6 months already, which is quite a gone by in an absolute flash. I can't believe it.
So this is much more than just a title bump. Then there's a distinct kind of step up in responsibility and kind of the kind of, you mentioned kind of directorship there as well, right?
Yeah. So up step in terms of like the level that I'm. It's not just a job title change, so I've stepped up in terms of like the leadership level that I'm on, now as well, and have inherited sort of data protection and risk as functional units. So I actually now look after risk for the enterprise, rather than just trying to sort of navigate integrating cyber risk to the broader ERM capability. That's now something that falls under my remit, which is a fantastic position to be in, and there's a lot of exciting stuff to do in that space, and I'm really enjoying it. And
great recognition of the work that you've been doing, right? To take
security,
the good security risk work that you've been doing, and kind of go, we'd like you to extend that across wider enterprise risk, I'm guessing.
Yes, you hope so. Anyway, you hope that's part of it, rather than just shoehorn in. Who likes risk? I think I just talk about risk too much, and they've gone, "Oh, Jonny quite likes risk. We'll give it to him and see how he gets on with it." No, I think it's a good recognition of actually some of the benefits of really thinking through how you communicate risk. Which is the whole sort of premise of this podcast. And I think I've spent a lot of work over the past few years making sure we're communicating cyber risk well, and in a way that is palatable to the executive and to the business, and repeatable and understandable, and all of these wonderful things. So I think it has been a recognition of that, in the sense that they must trust that I have a good grasp of risk and how to do it. And we've had some interesting conversations recently on how we scale what we do in cyber to other risk domains within the business, and that's very much at the forefront of how I'm thinking at the moment.
What would you go back and tell yourself, let's say 9 months ago? You were kind of longing in a positive way, your own professional development and that kind of thing. Lots of people talk about what it means to be CISO and the skills kind of required, but kind of that aside, what would you go back and kind of say to yourself kind of in advance of this? Because it does sound, from chatting beforehand as well, like you say, there's quite a lot of additional responsibility that sounds like Forge is taking a very mature way to what the role is and what the responsibilities bestowed upon it are. Where there are other organizations where it might be just a title that's kind of thrown out there, chief X officer for whatever it is. Rather, it sounds like this is a bit more of a mature appointment.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I still report into the executive rather than being part of the executive. You know, the title comes from, I think I said in my interview for when I joined as head of cyber, I was like, I want to be a CISO. So I think, you know, there's part of that recognizing the industry standard around it as well. But, you know, certainly going from a head of to a director level has been a step up, and it's been something that I probably underestimated sort of the step change that would come with it. You know, and if I was talking to myself 9 months ago, I'd be saying you're going to be ready to be very ruthless with your prioritization. You know, and make sure that you find. Thankfully, we found somebody to sort of focus on the SecOps side of things, which is always my background. And they've come in and they've hit the ground running, which is helping massively with the step change and sort of looking after the other functional areas. But also, I think I'd have said, don't underestimate the workload, you know, in terms of getting taken on the risk piece, because it's a huge area and very crucial part of the business. And, you know, whilst we had quite because it sat with our general counsel prior, and there was a good handover period that we had for that. Because we hadn't sort of backfilled the direct cyber day-to-day operational capability, it was tricky to try and keep myself out of the weeds.
All those priorities, yeah,
you know, and I suppose in some senses they're the more traditional CISO responsibilities around SecOps and security GRC and stuff like that, which has always been in the wheelhouse. But you know, because we're a small team, I do find myself in the weeds occasionally, you know, on very, you know, operational day-to-day problems, you know, even basic like alert-based conversations going on and general coverage-based conversations. We're handing more and more of them over and getting into a better position. But I think that the main lesson I've learned early on is just to be diligent with that time management and to be really ruthless with prioritization. And it's still a lesson to be learned for me. I think it's an ongoing journey.
I think I'd mirror that in my own kind of security management and executive leadership and kind of experiences. Yeah, being that kind of ruthless reprioritization as well. You know, just because it was the number one thing yesterday doesn't mean it's the number one thing today.
Exactly.
It's an important part. For people who might not know, would you mind giving us a quick overview of Forge Holidays Group as well? And
sure. So,
because I think it might surprise a few people.
No. So I think, you know, people. The brand itself is the two big divisions that are probably more recognizable brands within the group are Sykes, Cottages and Forge Holidays. And they are our two sort of major divisions. You know, we have a division called Batch Care, which is New Zealand based. But fundamentally, Forge Holidays is championing UK staycations. You know, so on the agency side, which is Sykes Cottages, we have about 25,000 properties across the UK and New Zealand. And then Forest Holidays, we've got a number of fantastic locations right within the heart of the forest, you know, and lodges with hot tubs and, you know, the opportunity to sort of get away from the maddening crowd and sort of be a bit more isolated with a luxury stay within the forest. And so it's, you know, I've been here for about 3 years now, and the business itself is private equity owned, and, you know, we've got a lot of growth mentality in the business. You know, we want to be bigger, we want to be better, and it's been a fantastic 3 years to be part of what has been a very cool and interesting business.
Does that mean there are some nice locations for team away days and meetings and things, or is that ring fence purely for generation activities?
Yeah, I definitely should think about that a little bit more. But, you know, we're so in demand, Rob, that, you know, getting hold of a cabin would be hard. Tricky. Yeah. So we've got to prioritise.
Good position to be in, right? Good position. And kind of, do you mind expanding a little bit on kind of, I suppose, your journey there? You said you've been with Forge for 3 years. Kind of, what's your background and your journey in cybersecurity to your current role?
Sure. I've got to be, you know, clear that, you know, it's been a bit of a crazy 7 years roughly since I sort of started the journey, you know, from tech through to, you know, cybersecurity, through to cybersecurity leadership. You know, my first cybersecurity leadership position was in oil and gas as opposed to travel and hospitality. So completely different sector, completely different set of considerations and concerns. Yeah. And I ran SecOps for an oil refinery based here in the Northwest for about 2 years. in my first leadership role before the opportunity for head of in Chester became a head of cybersecurity became available in Chester. And being the ambitious person that I am, thought a completely different tech stack, completely different industry, with the opportunity to step up and take ownership of the cybersecurity function rather than report into the CISO as I did in my prior role, was very attractive. And decided to take all the lessons that I'd learned in oil and gas and throw them out the window and take them into a sort of a high growth, entrepreneurial travel and hospitality, retail and hospitality business. Sounded like a really exciting opportunity. So came to Forge and took on the role as head of cybersecurity, newly formed team, greenfield environment, opportunity to build security the way that I wanted to build it. And really haven't looked back since. I've really enjoyed the time here. I think we've come a long way in a reasonably short period of time. And I think I've learned so much, even just in that 3-year period. And I've added to the knowledge gained as part of working in oil and gas, and then, completely sort of recultivated areas of it to fit.
Remarkably different kind of setup, right? Between, like you say, B2B, a strong focus on integrity, availability, obviously safety as a kind of product to those two, to a much more kind of consumer focused, like you say, data protection, confidentiality gear.
100%. But a
bunch of common threads, I suspect, and obviously transferable skills. So,
it's. I think what is often overlooked is is actually sort of the pressure around availability here as well. I mean, B2B was, you have got a whole host of other questions. You getting supplier questions coming in all the time. And you've got to respond to them and give them, the assurance, as part of that B2B relationship. And whereas weirdly, I think, to an extent, ethically, there's higher pressure around that B2C components as well, as you say, on the data piece and the confidentiality question. But there's no denying that there's always a focus on business disruption. I think you and I have had this conversation historically as well. And actually, I think when it comes to communicating cyber and making sure that the business is clear on what the risks are, that disruption piece is extremely, I don't want to say useful. That sounds like there's an ulterior motive.
It's very tangible for people, isn't it? And I suppose bringing it into that kind of into your space today, that is people's ability to get online and book a holiday.
Yes, exactly.
Pay some money, right? It is the shop front. It's like turning the sign round and putting closed up at 12:30 in the afternoon, rather than being open till 5 or 6 or whatever the opening hours are. Right?
And that's exactly and that's the message that has to. I mean, it comes with both. You got to go down sort of because obviously data protection massively important to us as a business. It sounds like a cliche, but it is. And I've seen that in the culture and the way that people operate. And certainly our DPO is all over it in that sense. But it's that availability question and that resilience question is something that is just very useful when it comes to communicating the potential impact of not doing this right and getting this right, and giving that consistent buy-in and making sure you've got that consistent buy-in for the program that you're running. And don't get me wrong, there's other ways of quantifying impact, and getting sort of the reputational, regulatory, and the data sort of impact that comes as part of these things as well. But as you say, the tangibility of saying, we might not be able to have the shop front open is something that is a consistent, good barometer for how cyber is being brought into a business. Good for keeping it at the forefront of mind.
Yeah. Gotcha. And you mentioned there kind of when you started, it was pretty greenfield kind of scenario, presumably quite a bit of latitude therefore, to shape how you wanted. How did you, are there any kind of major shifts or differences between how you, not starting from scratch, but in that kind of like, okay, I get to shape my own program rather than, as part of a larger established team in a potentially more mature environment there. What were some of the differences or some of the things that you've introduced there?
So I mean, weirdly enough, and this is going to sound like such an arbitrary. One of the first things I did was move where we sat, and and it sounds like when you're coming in on a greenfield environment, so they'd made investments. They'd made investments in technology. They'd made investments in team. So there was a couple of analysts already. They were reporting into the IT operations team, and we kind of sat at the end of the row that was the IT operations team, and had a really good relationship with the IT operations team. But as part of establishing us as a function, and psychologically turning around to the business and saying, yeah, we are our own unit within tech, but we don't report in to IT operations. We are our own functional unit.
Yeah.
As part of that, it was kind of like, I don't think it sends the right message that we're sat at the end of
the little bolt-on on the end.
Yeah, a little bolt-on. So we had the opportunity to go and move and sit next to our legal team and our data protection team, because there was a space there, an ideal space for us right next to them there. And as much as it was one of those tiny little things that you wouldn't think would be important when you come in to establish a function in the greenfield, the psychological impact of just moving away from that IT operations, and we didn't lose the relationship with them that existed there. The team all got on really well with them. We have fantastic relationships to this day with IT operations, but it meant we improved the relationship with data protection, it improved the relationship with the legal team, and exposed ourselves to a different area of the business, whilst also solidifying that we are a singular team now. And as analysts, we have our own functional unit, and we're not, beholden to the requirements of IT operations. And again, it sort of reduced the conflict of, because I think there was an element of, the analysts felt they were being overruled a little bit at times. And, because as is the natural way, there's conflicting priorities between IT operations and cybersecurity. So just separating that was an important first step, psychological step. And it sounds weird to, highlight where you sit as being one of the things that you think about when you come in.
All important framing, right?
Exactly.
And like you say, the fact that it didn't detract from your relationship there, but actually allowed you to establish better relationships and communications with some of these other closely related teams, right? Lots of cybersecurity functions have, deal with legal colleagues, deal with data protection colleagues, that kind of thing. Exactly. That's not unusual. Obviously, technology as well, but they're all important relationships to maintain, aren't they?
100%. But other than that, it was, it was just a great opportunity to sort of turn around and say, right, you've made some investments, and they're good investments. We've got some technology. We need to now pull things together and make things work as a unit. So it's all well and good saying we're all going to sit together. We're a unit now. We're an operation. But I lent into, certainly in the first few months, I lent into sort of that SecOps background, it's like how to run a security operation. I came in with all of these, 100-day plan, what strategy delivery, all of that kind of thing. You get there and you go, well, there's no operating model here. The team don't really have a good frame of reference of what good looks like. They don't have a good frame of reference for what the day-to-day should look like. So it was really a case of coming in and setting up that operating model. I would always prioritize that coming into a greenfield, just so you can give a bit of consistency and transparency to the team, and the expectations for the team. I
was going to say expectations as well. Like, this is what is expected of us. Not necessarily of you. Obviously, everyone has a part to play, but it's kind of like, this is how we want to be seen and what we want to be known for in the business is doing this stuff. Yes. We need to be set up to deliver that. How do we go about doing it?
Yeah, and crucially as well, and again, it comes back to this communicating cyber question. There's a whole, there's outcomes, outputs, and then inputs. And if you haven't defined the outcomes that you need, then you don't really know what outputs you need to focus on. If you aren't sort of demonstrating and finding the appropriate outputs, then inevitably the business starts to focus on the inputs. And perception can be a woolly affair. Optics have to be handled, carefully, regardless of outputs and outcomes. But, if you aren't effectively measuring outputs and performance outputs that you believe are tangibly linked to the outcomes that you need to drive from an operation, then there's going to be questions asked, and the business are going to question the value of cybersecurity, because it's inherently invisible, if you don't do it right, and so, making sure that you have a good barometer of the outputs, you've tangibly linked them to the outcomes, and you've communicated those outcomes to the appropriate leadership and the team, both up and down the chain. You've communicated those outcomes, those outputs. Then you measure those outputs. That operating model drives those outputs, gives you the information that you need, the metrics that you need, and then you can start to sort of create the flywheel of getting buy-in and demonstrating performance back to the business.
So I guess logical next question then was, what were some of those outputs and outcomes that you were focusing on, right? And was there any particular framework, how did you go about communicating those and the good work that you were doing? Because obviously it's been well received over the last few years, right?
Yeah, I do think we've made a lot of progress. You can go down the SecOps route and you can turn around and say, right, okay, well, we had some great detection technology that had been invested in, but they didn't really know what value they were getting out of the detection technology they had some great analysts and engineers in the team, but they weren't quite sure what value they were getting out of them. Probably, if you want to look at some basic, I don't want to call them vanity metrics, but they can be a little bit vanity metrics, sort of like tangibly linking it to the outcomes. But, you mean time to triage, you mean time to detect, you mean time to respond. Establishing that as part of the SecOps function, I think is quite important, because, that's what, when you've got a good grasp of things like mean time to detect, number of alerts, how long it's taking you to close them on average, vulnerability metrics, you know then for your team, then these aren't necessarily the metrics you put in front of the board, but you can talk to them. Our CTO is very, au fait. So when I'm talking with the CTO, on technical sort of metrics, he quite likes them. He quite like to see them. I would never not share them with him, in terms of general.
Well, it's a kind of internal efficiency and effectiveness kind of
exactly. And whether we believe that maintaining a sub 1 hour mean time to triage metric is going to be an effective barometer for the fundamental outcome of no significant cyber incidents is, I think there's plenty of debate in the industry that would challenge that. But what it does is, you establish, you have your big goal, you establish the metrics that you want to do. You say, okay, this is the target, this is where we're going to get to. That gives clarity to the team. The team then know what they need to do to get to that. And then it becomes, eventually that just becomes part of the whirlwind. Our KPIs around mean time to triage now are kind of like a given. You've got to hit this. We're not just going to keep moving the target. We're happy with where they are now, but it means that then you can focus on, as you go to our team now, are really focusing on true positive rate, as opposed to, because that's more tangible to the outcomes. It's like, are we actually detecting the stuff that we need to detect, as opposed to just focusing on the performance metrics that go into it. But it's all very SecOps oriented.
That's all quite kind of really useful stuff to be and great to be measuring from a team perspective, because it gives you that measure of how are we performing. I know the answer to this question, but that's not how those aren't the things that you then choose to present up, right, to people outside of the team and up to the board and that kind of thing. So I'm assuming coming into this greenfield site, it gave you the opportunity to indulge your, as a self-professed risk geek, some of that risk side of things. How have you found that, and how do you go about communicating cyber up to your board?
Yeah. So, listen, there's a couple, I reframe this all the time, and, what is the board and who are you talking to on the board? Is it an ops board? Is this something that's going to go to Topco? Is it something that's,
it's a really important, we should probably spend a couple of, at least 30 seconds on it, right? That lots of people, board is conflated with essentially the executive management team or senior leadership team, right? And most organizations, once they get past a certain point, will have, an executive committee, the kind of day-to-day CXO type suite who are involved in the day-to-day executive management of the business, and then the board being a separate entity that comprises usually CEO, CFO, maybe a couple of other executive roles, but then a bunch of non-executive roles. So they're people who who aren't involved in the day-to-day running and are there as part of the governance and the checks and balances of the organization. So
yes.
I've got a non-exec role with the British Library, for example. I'm not involved in the day-to-day operations of that. I'm there as an advisor and to kind of help provide a bit of governance and check and balance. So yeah, probably worth being explicit about that, right? So you've got, and yes, I get interested in whether there's any differences. Like, how do you approach that kind of exco type presentation and board presentation differently, or are they the same?
I think you have to an extent, and and again, you'll be given your slot and your period of time that's part of the presentation, and you got to kind of work out, So I'm a detailed person, and I have, as part of like establishing what do I want to go to the exec, what do I want to go to my boss who's a member of the exec, what do I want to report to him on and give him insight to, and what do I want to report on, because we've done like exec tabletops, where we talk about the risk and the risk tolerances and stuff like that. What do I want to have that communication be focused around? And I think where it is consistent is that I want to be able to give a statement on risk, on cyber risk, and that's what I've always tried to sort of move towards. And the greenfield benefit was, I didn't have to unpick, a long-established security GRC function that had a very specific. Because when I took on the head of cyber role, that included, it wasn't just a SecOps role; it was like the full sort of cybersecurity remit, and establishing how we would communicate the risk was something that I as I had very, had big ideas about and wanted to move away from your more qualitative traditional methods. So I did have the opportunity to set up our own sort of internalized sort of quantified model. And that enabled me to come to, the layers of the question, it let me sort of understand, okay, well, what's appropriate for, top co, what's appropriate for executives, what's appropriate for reporting to my boss, Adam, our CTO as well. So that was a conscious effort right from the beginning that from the start,
this needs to be something that we're talking about in kind of pounds and pence or dollars and cents. It's not kind of red, amber, green. It's not kind of wishy-washy. 100%. Our risk appetite is cautious or balanced or anything like that.
I don't mind something a bit more wishy-washy on appetite, Robin. I like, and so I think and we've one of the things that came out of our more recent exec board risk update was, we want to sort of redefine our appetite statements. And I don't mind that being non-quantified. I think, that is like, that's your purpose, your vision, your top of your house model. As long as then when you come to various risk domains, that the tolerances are set within those domains. And that's what, for me, and I'm sort of probably trampling over a load of different risk ontologies and definitions at the moment. But for me, the appetite is more that sense of it, whereas the tolerance is where you get into like, okay, what financial thresholds are we willing to accept within this area? And you can set an aggregate threshold for the business off the back of that. But for me, the appetite is like, I just want a statement around how we feel about it. And I don't think that's like, as much as I am a huge advocate for staying away from being too
well. You're having your cake and eating it, right? You're setting that kind of numerical level and saying we could have a qualitative kind of shorthand for how we describe that, right? But
semi-quantified is always the answer, isn't it? It's like
having some of those numbers. I think there is really useful for giving yourself a bit of that finish line, though, right? Of saying, have we done it? Have we hit that? Have we hit that level that the business has said we want to hit?
Yes.
A useful way of communicating and engaging with that.
And I'd advocate for that all the time, yeah.
Is that, so does that kind of form the core of how you communicate? If we focus on Exco to begin with, kind of, and that's
probably the best. I mean, that's where most of the exposure has come from and most of the sort of communication goes to be fair. Anything above that would go via, members of the top board anyway.
Yeah. And what's the kind of, I guess one of the things that people often worry about is if they're going to put the shift to trying to quantify things and express it financially is you're also shifting from your security world that you know and you are the expert in, and that lots of other management team are not experts in, into something that is a more common language that makes it easier to have those discussions.
Yes.
But I guess where you're kind of, people sometimes feel a bit more exposed, right? Because it's kind of, well, they can unpick, they do understand that, how X and Y relate to each other. Yeah. Is there any particular advice that you'd give a CISO who's worried about being grilled by a CFO or someone like that? I kind of see some of the benefits, but I don't necessarily want to make the leap, because what if I'm challenged on this stuff, on the inputs and some of the assumptions I've made?
Yeah, I mean, I have been challenged. Pardon?
Do you think that's a fair kind of concern?
Absolutely. If you start putting numbers in front of the board, they're all right. Where's this come from? What are the assumptions? Because I think and as we move away from the tech-based language as well, there's a really poor rhetoric, I think, in the cybersecurity community, which is the board don't get, they should get the tech language. They don't get it. Almost like they're daft or something stupid like that. These people aren't. They don't not understand. They just don't have an awful lot of time. They're time poor rather than anything else. So being able to sort of condense the absolute plethora of metrics that are available to us into something that is a reasonable statement of our exposure and of our posture, of our risk positioning, is something that is very useful. But of course, you're going to be challenged on it when you come to that point, and they'll want sort of. Weirdly enough, you'll get more buy-in for some of the other questions and the other metrics and the other stuff that sits behind it, I think, if you go in with those initially, because that's when you go sort of definitely nice. But if you condense it down into something that's a bit more of an aggregate statement of risk, then one, it'll be understood further, but they'll challenge it and they'll want to understand it. Certainly, for me...
Do you think you get more challenge because of that? So sometimes challenge is perceived as being a negative thing, but actually that challenge shows a level of understanding and engagement, rather than challenge and engagement as two sides of essentially the same thing, right? If you're being asked questions about your number, where you weren't previously because you just said it was red or amber, is showing a greater level of engagement and interest in what you're presenting.
It's better and it's easier, and it helps with transparency of it as well. So if you want to communicate certain gaps, and you could talk, okay, why is this here, why is it there, and you sort of work it back, and there's gaps there, but you can communicate that then in a way that is understood and meaningful and transparent, and far better to be challenged on what you're coming with. The defensibility of it comes from understanding it and knowing what your inputs are and what your model is based on, and just being able to talk to it, in a very sort of simplistic way, sort of say, okay, this is where this number comes from, this is why we've assessed it at this probability, this is the reference class we use, this is the data source that we used for it. And then, I mean, the real challenge I had, I think it was probably about 6 months ago, when I gave an update on our cyber risk posture, was around reputational impact, and actually the challenge I was given was that they felt I was understating the reputational impact, which is again is a really interesting. Most experiences of other CISOs I speak to when it comes to stating the risk to the executive, the challenges are it's not that bad. It's not going to be as extreme as that. Whereas to be in a position where the challenge was coming, so I think you've undercalled the reputational impact that this risk scenario would have if it materialised, was actually quite, it was interesting because, I think you and I have had conversations about share price as an indication of reputational impact. We're not, fundamentally, we're not a publicly listed, so that didn't have much. When I sort of said, actually, no, share price isn't massively impacted by that. When you're a private equity firm that doesn't, have a concern around share price, it didn't land in the same way, and it was kind of like, well, actually, a lot of our properties are, there's a consumer component there. So it's not just a question of, will customers still book a holiday with us if we suffered a significant data breach? There's a question of, will owners trust us to, to
be their broker, essentially.
Exactly. Will they trust us as, and there's, there'd be a downstream, financial impact for disruption for them as well, because they, a lot of people use us as a platform in order to make money. So that's, other considerations that we have to have around reputation. So it was really great. It gave me the opportunity to go away and have a real think about how we were modeling the reputational impact in financial terms, look at, actually where would we potentially diverge from that prior assumption or that prior reference class around share prices as a barometer for reputational impact.
I suppose working quite a lot with private equity backed firms and with private equity to do due diligence and a load of value creation work with their portfolio companies. There's a piece there is often they've got an investment hypothesis of what revenues and where you're going to get to as a business over a certain time period, right? So whilst share price is not a good barometer, there's some pretty clear growth plans that they want to try and hit. And if you can turn around and say, well, we're only going to make 90% of that instead of 100% of it, or what that deviation might look like over the investment period, all of a sudden it becomes really tangible, because they also know the exit multiple that they want to achieve on the valuation of the business, right? So it's in some ways it becomes a pretty compelling point, and well understood point, especially up at those kind of PE backed boards, Topco and things like that.
Definitely, and you've got to be able, you've got to be conversant with EBITDA and other terminologies. You've got to understand it, and we have big shining star goals, wildly important goals, following the 4 disciplines of execution model as a business, and aligning the cyber goals to those big goals around revenue growth, around property growth is incredibly important, and fundamentally it's helped us hone in on that North Star of, we will be resilient to significant cyber incidents, cyber breaches, data protection incidents, etc.
And so you ended up, did the CFO provide you any other input into revising this reputational risk up, or?
So we've had, we've had more conversations now since inheriting the broader risk question, and we've tried to sort of think about, okay, well, what would that reputational sort of look in other risk domains as well? So it still needs work. We still need to think about it. There's, you're constantly tweaking and reforecasting the model, in terms of like what you think the loss interval is going to be, what your confidence in that is, where you think the likelihood's going to be. So we've made progress, but I think it's just always going to be something that needs tweaking and touching and understanding. But I think we're in better shape with that forecast now.
And that kind of dialogue is presumably quite important as well, in terms of how do you go about introducing reputation will be something that makes sense to lots of people and they can kind of grapple. There's a bunch of new risks that people are starting to worry about, scenarios around artificial intelligence and AI and things like that. How do you go about kind of introducing new scenarios, new risk like that? Obviously there's the kind of trying to put some numbers to it, but there's a whole raft of other kind of softer things that you might approach as well.
Yeah, I think we're very much an AI first. The rhetoric for the business and the message from the top down here is, we want to be a first mover, a second mover. We want to be somebody who is at the forefront of innovation and embedding AI where appropriate, getting the efficiency benefits from AI, getting seeking out the opportunities for AI, and obviously that comes with the risk associated, with wanting to adopt in that kind of way. We've been involved as a security team and as a governance team from the outset in all things, AI. I've got to say credit to the business. They wanted to do it right from the outset, and almost have inherently understood that that where there is opportunity, there is risk, and vice versa. And whilst we want to be a first mover and adopt this, we want to do it in a way that's safe. And in a way that is going to mitigate that downside risk that comes with, wanting to be that first or second mover around AI. So the risk scenarios have kind of been there already. I'm also extremely lucky that our CEO is extremely cognizant of cyber risk generally. So he's already kind of drawn the link between the two, not to sort of degrade his wish to sort of really push forward with the AI piece. But we've been very aware from the outset of the sort of the data implications.
And understanding that digital and cyber are essentially two sides of the same coin, right? You know, it's kind of, you want all the upside of this digital innovation comes with an element of cyber risk, right? So socializing that presumably really important then. No surprises in inverted commas.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've got to a point where, so we've added in now some to the cyber risk register. So, like, you know, I've got strong beliefs around how many risk scenarios should be tracked, Rob. You know, I think if you start plugging in every operational level risk to your register, it becomes white noise very quickly. And if you're going to decompose risks to component areas, you've got to think about it very carefully and the impact of if there is value in even doing it to that level.
Yeah.
You know, a vulnerability on a server is a problem of vulnerability management, not risk management.
It's an issue, not a risk.
Right? Exactly. You know, something like that. Like you risk. So, you know, your risk management should be vulnerability informed rather than vulnerability driven. You know, you want to keep that language separate to an extent. It's a control efficiency question, in my view, and that's how it should be filtered.
Yeah, and I suppose to expand on that a bit, that might be, we have a risk of losing customers' personal information, of a data breach risk.
Yep. Yes.
The likelihood of that happening increases if we've got 10, 100, 1,000 critical vulnerabilities in the systems that hold that. And that doesn't mean that we've got 10, 100, 1,000 risks that this thing's open and been unpatched, right? It's a subset of that's an issue, kind of, and like you say, an effectiveness point at that point. Why haven't these been patched? Why are we doing? And then if you can't address that, let's update this risk then, so that, you know, it is now it's 50-50 as to whether that's going to happen this year, rather than, 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 or whatever it might have been instead, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly sort of the workflow that we operate with. But it's like back to sort of pull that to sort of the AI question. So I'm quite diligent with adding risk scenarios. So, like, is this something that actually informs an existing risk scenario, or is it something that constitutes a separate? Where I draw the distinction, and what's helped me is how well I can align control sets to specific risks and how much I would weight control sets against those risks, and where I think efficiency becomes a real question with it. And I do think there's some novelty in the attack surface around some of the AI questions, which is why we've now decided to add in 2 separate, distinct AI risk scenarios to our cyber register. And, you know, I mean, in terms of, you know, the loss interval, you know, that ended up being easier than I anticipated. You know, certainly when it came to sort of the data breach as a result of AI proliferation and AI compromise, followed similar loss patterns.
Yeah, because I guess a common kind of critique or kind of perception might be that it takes too much time and you need too much, you need lots of data in order to be able to get to that answer. There's kind of an analysis paralysis.
Yeah. 100%. You know,
but actually you're saying, you know, it doesn't need to be a full-time kind of academic exercise there. It's actually quite, you can be quite prompt and actionable then to avoid those sorts of things.
You know, at the risk of you know, taking it down a sort of a Bayesian versus frequentist approach to statistics, you know, that like you can, like, risk is subjective, you know, even if you use a quantified model, you know, subjectivity is absolutely inherent in uncertainty, and uncertainty is absolutely inherent in risk. You know, risk is us trying to understand uncertainty and and uncertainty
and reduce it where you can, right?
And narrow it where possible. You know, so when it comes to really getting to grips with where to start, you know, I think your prior, like, you touched on it before, is like, you know, the murky world of cybersecurity as it's communicated, and actually do we want to invite that scrutiny and transparency and that challenge, is, you know, actually, you're not devaluing subject matter expertise, you know, as part of going down a quantified route. You don't have to have inherently perfect data sets to be able to start quantifying in a meaningful way. You have to understand how much credence and credibility you'd give to sort of your posterior data set. But your prior probability is, I do believe, while it should start from a reference class, and I would always advocate for using your prior, in a Bayesian sense, using a reference class. You can start with your subject matter expertise and, do like a like for like with what, via the same process that people would do for qualitative. Just express it, instead of taking it from a 1 to 5, take it to a percentage score, and start with that. And then you can start to factor in evidence. If you can establish on your reference class that businesses of your size, with your headcount, of your revenue profile, in your industry, in your geographic location, you've got 5 points there that can give you a reasonable reference class. And then there's data points out there, Verizon, Scientia, IBM, NCSC, they all have data points around these areas of focus where you can go, well, hang on, businesses our size in our space with our headcount in the UK on average have suffered a ransomware. 1 in 10 of them have suffered a ransomware incident in the past 3 years.
As good as, like you say, if you've got a kind of 5 by 5 and you've got something that's a 4, lots of people also then have impact matrices that explain what a 4 is, and it will, when you actually look at it, it says, well, that we think that a 4 is somewhere between 50 and 80% maybe, and you go, okay, great, well that gives you something to start. You can split the difference and
exactly
something in the middle and use that. You're, if anything, just translating the current approach you've got to something that you can then document your assumptions and refine them better over time, right?
Yeah, and it's the same with the confidence interval on your loss, and how much you think you would lose in the event of that probability being realised, and in the event of a loss incident associated with that risk scenario, and rather than expressing it as a 1 to 5 or a bracket, you give it a range, and then you can sort of take a distribution of that range, and that will come to sort of like your expected loss value. As soon as you get to expected loss values, you're working in quantified outputs, and you don't have to become, au fait with the intricacies of running Monte Carlo simulations to be working from a quantified risk approach. That's the next step. And if you have an expected loss value, you can start running, Monte Carlo simulations, and there are platforms that will do that for you and help you with it. And I think if you get to that stage, then again, you loop back to that credibility question. If you can talk through each of these steps and each of these things in reasonably simplistic language. I've been throwing things like Bayesian and frequentist around, you can avoid them, but you can start explaining these things through in reasonably simple terms. Then you get it, people kind of go, okay, right, fine, that makes sense. I understand that logically. And it helps build the credibility in terms of the way you're thinking about it and the way you're approaching risk as well. I
think there's a whole other podcast where we can do a deep dive into a whole bunch of those terms and share a bunch of knowledge on that. But as we come to the end of this episode, really appreciate your time today, Jonny. It's been a fascinating conversation. What do you think? Final question, then, just quickly. Okay. I suppose. What does success look like for you as a CISO in 2026, or what do you think? What do you think others should be focusing on?
Do you know what we don't like? And I've said this, a few times. Like the goal that I consistently sort of communicate to business is that we will not have a significant cyber incident, and that we won't suffer a major incident. And how you define that can vary, but I think we avoid it because we're worried about that, like taking ownership of it and the things that are outside our control. And when it comes to the risk that exists, it's not our risk, it's the business risk. Whereas I kind of go, well, it is like, I think it's for us to sort of take on that meaty challenge of just saying, no, do you know what? Like, our job here is to make sure we don't have a significant cyber incident, data incident. And I think saying that carries weight. And I think that goal for us in 2026 will be consistent. There are very, very nuanced things we have to consider as part of it. I think 2026 will be the year of agentic AI and the concerns around agentic AI, if we want to boil it down to sort of the common talking point at the moment. But for me, it will be avoiding significant impact. It will be maintaining and improving that resilience and our ability to make sure that if something does happen. So when I say no major impact, no major incidents, I don't mean things won't happen. What I mean is we'll be able to handle it in a way that doesn't involve major impact to the business.
Having confidence in what you're doing rather than trying to scare people with fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Right?
Yeah, turn around and say, no, we're making a difference here, and we're gonna, and then you come back to the other growth targets and the growth goals that the business has. If you're avoiding business disruption, if you're saying no, we're going to deliver no major incidents as part of our goals for this year, that then links very directly to what the business wants to do.
Great. Jonny, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you ever so much for your time today. All the best with the new role, the expanded remit, enterprise as well. Real success story. Thank you for sharing your perspectives, and hope to speak to you again soon.